Imagine a commercial airliner, right? Like a massive one with 300 passengers on board.
Right, yeah.
Now imagine that plane crashing 3 times a week,
Wow.
every single week, for an entire year.
I mean, the world would come to an absolute standstill.
Exactly. Air travel would be completely grounded globally. You'd have parliaments holding emergency sessions and, thousands of investigators crawling over every inch of the wreckage.
Just desperate to figure out exactly what was going wrong.
Right. But right now, in the Netherlands, there are roughly 900 unexplained extra deaths happening every single week.
Which is mathematically the same thing.
It's the exact same number of people.
Mm-hmm.
And a controversial new documentary claims that the government, the media, and the medical establishment are, well, they're actively looking the other way. Welcome to the deep dive.
It's a frankly staggering premise for a film.
It really is.
Yeah.
And we are so thrilled you're here with us today because we are unpacking a highly complex, dense, and honestly deeply polarizing piece of source material.
Very polarizing, yeah.
We're looking at an extensive interview from a channel called Lighthouse TV. It features a Dutch filmmaker named Frank de Rooij.
Right, and he's discussing his new documentary, which is called Stilte Schreeuwt.
Which translates to The Silent Screams.
Exactly. And our mission today is to thoroughly examine the central mystery that this filmmaker is trying to document.
Right.
The film basically builds this intricate case around a reported massive spike in unexplained, quote-unquote, excess mortality in the years following the pandemic.
And more importantly, the institutional reluctance to investigate it.
Yes, exactly.
But before we really get into the mechanics of this, we need to set the table for you, the listener. Because the material we're analyzing today, it touches on incredibly charged political, medical, and social themes.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about COVID-19 origins, vaccine safety, government policy.
The integrity of scientific data itself.
Yeah. And our role here is not to adjudicate the medical science.
No.
Or to validate the political claims. I mean, we are not epidemiologists.
We're definitely not. Our job is just to impartially report on the claims, the data points, and the viewpoints that are presented in this specific interview.
Right. We want to help you understand the architecture of the argument that Frank de Rooij and the experts in his documentary are constructing.
It's really an exercise in listening to a perspective that the filmmaker claims is being actively suppressed.
Yeah.
Right? And rigorously analyzing the logic of how they connect these very disparate dots.
Okay, let's unpack this. We should probably start exactly where the filmmaker starts, which is the numbers.
Okay, baseline, yeah.
Because to understand the controversy, you have to understand what normal looks like.
Right.
Normally, mortality in a highly developed nation like the Netherlands is a very predictable, mathematically stable metric.
Demographers and actuaries can basically tell you with incredible precision how many people are going to pass away in a given year.
Yeah, the interview actually cites an immunologist, Theo Schetters, who points out that historically it's roughly 0.86% of the Dutch population.
Which translates to what, about 145,000 to 150,000 people passing away annually?
Right. It's grim, but it's consistent.
It's a baseline.
Then, of course, a novel viral outbreak hits. The mortality rate shoots up.
Which you completely expect. It's a massive shock to the system.
Right. But the film's core argument hinges on what is happening right now in the post-pandemic years.
Because that baseline hasn't settled back down.
Exactly. The documentary presents data showing that mortality is consistently running over that historical baseline by about 23,000 people a year.
Which is where you get that 900 extra deaths per week figure.
Yes. And what makes this so baffling, and the film leans heavily into this, by the way, is how mortality statistics are actually supposed to behave after a mass casualty event.
Oh, right, the modeling.
Yeah, if you look at historical models, after a severe pandemic, you usually see a significant dip in the mortality rate in the years immediately following.
Right, because of what epidemiologists call the harvesting effect, or I think mortality displacement.
Yes, mortality displacement. It sounds very clinical, but the mechanics are straightforward.
Oh, so?
Well, a severe respiratory virus disproportionately affects the most vulnerable, right? The elderly, people with severe multiple comorbidities.
Right.
And because those individuals tragically succumb to the initial shock of the virus earlier than they statistically would have.
The subsequent years technically have fewer deaths than the historical average.
Exactly. That vulnerable demographic has already been depleted.
You'd expect a valley after the peak.
But the documentary is pointing at a sustained, elevated plateau.
Now, let me push back on the raw data for just a second, because, numbers can be incredibly noisy.
Sure.
If you're a demographer, you know population's age. The baby boomer generation is getting older.
Right.
Couldn't a significant chunk of these 23,000 extra deaths just be the natural result of a massive demographic shift?
I mean, demographic aging is absolutely a major factor in long-term mortality modeling, and any robust statistical analysis has to adjust for population age structures.
Right.
But the filmmaker's argument isn't just that the raw numbers are high. His argument is really about how the national institutions are actively managing and framing those numbers to make the anomaly disappear.
Ah, right. This is where they introduced the Dutch National Statistics Office.
The CBS.
Right, Central Bureau voor de Statistiek.
Yeah, the CBS is basically the gold standard for data in the Netherlands. But when pressed on these excess deaths, the interview alleges that the statistics office actually shifted the baseline.
I want to make sure we really understand the mechanics of a baseline shift, because it sounds like, I don't know, bureaucratic jargon.
It does, yeah.
But the implications are massive. It's essentially grading on a curve, right?
What do you mean?
Well, if you give a test and the entire class fails because the material was impossibly hard, you don't use that failing average as the new standard for what a normal grade is moving forward.
Right, that's a perfect analogy. But according to the documentary, that is functionally what the statistics office did. They allegedly integrated the high mortality years of the pandemic into their reference models for the new normal.
Oh, man. So if your mathematical baseline suddenly includes a mass casualty event, then an extra 23,000 deaths doesn't even trigger an alarm in the software?
Exactly. It just looks like the new status quo.
We're mathematically erasing the anomaly.
Yeah. And the film points out that when the statistics office was asked to investigate why these people were dying, like what the actual underlying causes were, they gave this incredible bureaucratic runaround.
What did they say?
They claimed they didn't have the budget to do a deep dive and that investigating potential medical side effects wasn't really their job.
So who did they point to?
They pointed to organizations like LIREB.
LIREB, okay, that's the Dutch Pharmacovigilance Center, right?
Yes. They're the ones specifically tasked with tracking adverse medical events.
Right.
But the source claims that when you go to LIREB, they don't view death as a general side effect, that they're equipped to investigate on a macro epidemiological scale.
Really?
Yeah, they just look at individual reports. So LIREB points right back to the statistics office.
Oh, that is so frustrating. It's a closed loop of accountability.
Exactly.
The statistics office says, ask the medical trackers. The medical trackers say, ask the statisticians.
And meanwhile, the baseline is shifted, so no one officially has to acknowledge the 900 extra deaths a week.
If this is happening, you just have to ask, why? Why wouldn't a government want to launch a massive, well-funded inquiry to figure this out?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the documentary addresses that exact question by bringing in Peter Omtzigt.
Oh, he's a very prominent Dutch politician, right?
Yeah.
Known for digging into institutional scandals.
Right. He initially pushed hard for academic inquiries into the excess mortality. He was demanding answers on the floor of Parliament.
Good.
But the film argues that the brick wall he hit wasn't just incompetence, it was structural.
The structural issue comes down to liability.
Yes.
And the source introduces this brilliant Dutch phrase to explain it. De slager keurt zijn eigen vlees.
The butcher inspecting his own meat. Because when governments around the world rolled out these medical interventions, they signed massive procurement contracts with pharmaceutical companies.
Right.
And a central pillar of those contracts, as highlighted by Professor Ronald Meester in the film, was indemnification.
Indemnification.
Right.
So the governments took over the liability from the producers.
Exact.
Meaning, if a product is defective, or if it causes severe, unforeseen damage to a percentage of the population,
The company that made it doesn't pay the damages.
the state pays, the taxpayer pays.
Yeah. And the financial exposure is astronomical. I mean, we are talking about tens of millions of doses administered in a single country.
Right.
If the government is the entity forced to foot the bill for any potential damage, it creates a colossal moral hazard.
Yeah, the film argues that the government is structurally and financially disincentivized from uncovering any negative data.
Right. If the butcher is the one who has to pay a massive bankrupting fine every time he finds tainted meat in his shop, you better believe his inspections are going to be incredibly brief.
Oh, he's definitely going to find a way to call it perfectly good meat.
Exactly. And the documentary doesn't just leave this as a high-level theory about contracts either.
Right. They introduce a data analyst, Wouter Akema.
Yes, Wouter Akema. He decided to see how this inspection was actually happening in real time.
And he's a fascinating figure in this narrative because he didn't just read the summary reports put out by l'Arab or the European agencies.
No, he went straight to the raw databases.
We should probably explain how he did this because it wasn't just like clicking a download button once.
Right.
He was scraping the databases.
Which means what, exactly, for people who might not be familiar?
So for those listening who might not know, scraping basically means writing a piece of code that automatically extracts massive amounts of data from an API or a web portal, and it does it on a continuous schedule.
Like every day.
Yeah. He was pulling the entire database of reported side effects day after day and saving every single iteration.
Oh, wow. So by doing that, he essentially created a time machine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because relational databases are usually dynamic, right? When a record gets updated, the old version is just overwritten.
It's gone.
Right, it's gone. But because Alkema had snapshots of the database every single day, he could compare them. He could track the life cycle of a single medical report over time.
That is brilliant. And what he claims to have found is deeply unsettling.
Yeah.
Alkema says he watched reports of severe side effects systematically get downgraded.
What do you mean by downgraded?
Well, for example, a doctor might submit a report that a patient suffered a severe neurological event or, they were hospitalized.
Right.
Days later, Alkema claims he would watch that specific entry in the database be recoded into what the Dutch call kitchen and garden ailments.
Kitchen and garden ailments.
And minor everyday complaints, like a headache or a sore arm.
Are you kidding me?
No. And in some cases, he claims entire reports of severe events just completely vanished from the system.
Okay, if that's true, that fundamentally alters the safety profile being presented to the world.
It does. And Alkema ties this right back to those liability contracts.
Right, because he highlights a specific contractual clause where the state allegedly committed to purchasing 10 doses per person.
10 doses per person for 470 million European residents.
That is a staggering commitment of public funds. And they're locked in, regardless of whether the interventions proved entirely effective or safe over the long term.
Right.
But okay, let's look at Alkema's data scraping critically for a second here.
Sure, let's play devil's advocate.
We're talking about the middle of a chaotic, once-in-a-century global health crisis.
Yeah, total chaos.
Information is flooding into these pharmacovigilance centers from thousands of tired doctors, panicked patients, understaffed hospitals.
Overwhelming amounts of data.
Exactly. Couldn't this data manipulation just be standard database cleanup?
What do you mean?
I mean, you're going to get duplications, right? A patient reports a symptom online, their doctor reports the exact same symptom. Maybe a nurse does too.
Right.
So a data manager has to go in, merge those files, or delete the duplicates. That's just data hygiene.
Well, that is the standard and highly necessary process of data reconciliation. Any large data set requires cleaning.
Right.
However, the film's argument is that Alkema wasn't just seeing deduplication.
It wasn't.
No. Merging two identical files is one thing. Taking a file that clearly says hospitalized for myocarditis and manually changing the code to mild chest discomfort is an entirely different mechanism.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
One is cleaning. The other is actively altering the historical record.
Right.
If severe outcomes are being systematically scrubbed or downgraded, the epidemiological data basically becomes a fiction.
Which puts the actual doctors on the front lines in an impossible position.
It really does.
If the government is compromised by liability and the safety databases are allegedly being sanitized, how do medical professionals explain the sickness and the excess death they're seeing in their own clinics?
Well, the documentary actually does a pretty good job of showing the friction here.
Yeah.
It presents contrasting medical viewpoints, starting with Andreas Voss.
Okay, Voss is a microbiologist, and he was a prominent member of the OMT, right?
Yes.
For those who don't know, the Outbreak Management Team. They were the primary advisory body to the Dutch government.
Right. They wielded immense power during the pandemic. Their recommendations essentially became law overnight.
Exactly. So what's his take?
Well, Voss represents the institutional viewpoint. When he's asked about the excess mortality, he defends the interventions entirely.
Okay.
He relies on the official studies to state that the vaccines prevented mass casualties.
But he still has to account for those 900 extra deaths a week, right? They're still happening.
He does, and according to the interview, Voss suggests looking at alternative variables.
What?
He theorizes that perhaps there was a sudden, massive spike in vaping that could account for respiratory deaths.
Vaping? Really?
Yeah. Or he points to the secondary effects of the lockdowns.
Okay, no, that's interesting.
He talks about the psychological stress, the isolation, the severe lack of exercise, and crucially, the delayed medical screenings.
Right, people missing cancer diagnoses because the hospitals were overwhelmed.
Exactly.
The irony there is just thick enough to cut with a knife.
Seriously.
The OMT, the very body Voss sat on, they were the architects of those lockdowns. They enforced the isolation and the delay of routine medical care.
Yep. And the filmmaker certainly highlights that contradiction.
It's like the institution is allegedly using the devastating collateral damage of its own mandated policies to explain away a mortality anomaly.
Rather than investigating the new pharmaceutical variable introduced to the entire population.
Right, and the film contrasts Voss's high-level institutional view with someone working directly in the trenches, right? Esther Hoff.
Yes, Esther Hoff. She worked for an organization called C-Support.
Which was set up specifically to help patients suffering from long COVID.
Exactly. And Hoff is dealing with the chronically ill on a daily basis.
Right.
And her perspective fundamentally challenges the institutional narrative. She claims there is a massive, undeniable biological and symptomatic overlap between long COVID and reported vaccine injuries.
Oh, wow. And we're talking about debilitating symptoms here.
It's not just a lingering cough.
No, it's extreme, crushing fatigue where people physically cannot get out of bed. It's severe neurological issues, brain fog, and inability to tolerate normal levels of light or sound.
Right. Hoff is looking at these two groups of patients, those who say they're suffering from viral fallout and those who say they're suffering from an intervention injury.
Yeah.
And she is saying the symptom profiles are virtually identical. The mechanism of harm appears remarkably similar.
Yet, the medical system is aggressively demanding that these two groups be kept entirely separate.
Yes. And the way the system separates them is honestly one of the most disturbing parts of this entire narrative.
The interview describes a scenario where patients who believe, and whose doctors might even suspect, that they are suffering from a vaccine injury. They're being structurally pressured to accept a long COVID diagnosis instead.
It all comes down to financial and medical incentives.
It's like a false confession in a criminal justice system.
How so?
Well, imagine, you didn't commit a crime, right? But the prosecutor tells you, if you fight this, you get no bail, no support, and you sit in a cell for years. But if you just sign this paper saying you did it, you get probation and you get to go home to your family.
Right, you take the deal.
You take the deal. And in this medical scenario, you have people who are desperately sick, they can't work, they are losing their homes.
They're desperate.
If they try to claim a vaccine injury, they face a wall of institutional denial. Their insurance might fight them. The government won't recognize it.
But if they sign the paper and say, I have long COVID,
suddenly the doors unlock.
They get access to specialized clinics, they get government financial aid, they get recognized by society as victims of a pandemic rather than collateral damage of a policy.
The structural pressure to misdiagnose yourself is overwhelming.
But think about what that does. If you are forcing sick individuals to abandon the truth of their own medical history just to survive, what does that do to the science of epidemiology?
I mean, it obliterates it.
Completely.
If you have thousands of people entering the medical system and financial incentives dictate that they all get thrown into the long COVID bucket, regardless of the actual root cause, your data pool is contaminated at the source.
Exactly. If you want to research the prevalence of a specific side effect, but the system is designed to seamlessly relabel that side effect as viral fallout,
your studies will always show the intervention is safe.
it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
You cannot find what you systematically misclassify.
Wow. Which brings us to a really crucial pivot point in the documentary's argument.
Okay.
If the monitoring data is this chaotic and structurally biased now, how rigorous was the initial approval process?
Oh, right.
If we can't trust the spreadsheets today, what did the spreadsheets look like when these interventions were originally greenlit?
Well, the film brings back immunologist Professor Theo Shetters to analyze that exact regulatory sphere.
He looks at the EMA, right?
Yeah.
The European Medicines Agency and the American FDA.
Yeah. And Shetters really focuses on the sheer physical mechanics of the approval process.
Because this is where the logistics just don't add up.
Not at all.
The documentary points to the massive dossier of safety and efficacy data that the pharmaceutical companies submitted.
Right.
We're talking about 75,000 pages of highly complex, dense medical data.
And we really should contextualize what is actually in a 75,000-page regulatory submission.
It's not a novel.
No. It is granular clinical trial data, pharmacokinetics, complex statistical modeling, manufacturing protocols, and raw adverse event reports.
Right.
It requires teams of specialized biostatisticians, toxicologists, and immunologists just to parse it.
Didn't the FDA in America originally argue in court that it would take them like 75 years to safely redact and release these documents to the public?
Yes. It literally took an American judge ordering them to release the data to force it out.
Right. But here's where it gets really interesting. Once the data was released, Shedders looked at the timeline.
The approval timeline.
Yeah. The EMA approved the interventions just days after that 75,000-page dossier was submitted.
Which leads Stetters to a very simple, pragmatic question.
Who read it?
Right. Who actually read it?
It's physically impossible. You cannot speed read 75,000 pages of raw clinical data over a weekend.
Let alone critically analyze it, cross-reference the statistics, debate the findings in committee.
And reach a scientifically rigorous consensus in a matter of days. It just can't be done.
Exactly. So Shedders concludes that standard regulatory procedures were entirely bypassed.
Right.
His argument is that this was not a scientific review, it was a top-down administrative mandate.
The decision was already made.
And the dossier was just a formality.
But the filmmaker doesn't just rely on, an outside immunologist guessing at what happened.
No, he doesn't.
The documentary introduces internal corroboration from inside the EMA itself.
Yes, through a WOB request.
Which is the Dutch equivalent of a Freedom of Information Act request, right?
Right, and through that request, it was revealed that 12 EMA employees actually wrote formal letters to their own management expressing profound concern.
12 insiders blowing the whistle before the rollout even began.
And their concerns mirrored Shedders' exact points.
Wow.
They warned about a severe lack of transparency, questionable safety data within the trials, and an impossibly rushed timeline.
They were basically stating on the record that the regulatory firewall was failing.
Failing completely.
And if the regulatory firewall failed, then the entire concept of, quote-unquote, the science being this slow, methodical, objective process, it's just fractured.
It really is. And the film takes this a step further by looking at how scientific consensus was manufactured in the media after the rollout.
Okay, yeah. They bring in researcher Maurice DeHaan for this, right?
Yes. DeHaan looked at the official observational studies.
These were the studies that governments used to assure the public that the interventions were working perfectly.
Specifically, studies claiming to show that unvaccinated populations were dying at vastly higher rates.
Okay, we need to explain how an observational epidemiological study can be manipulated, because it's not always obvious to a layperson.
No, it's very subtle.
You don't have to fake the raw numbers, right? You just have to manipulate the categories.
Exactly.
So how did DeHaan prove these studies were flawed?
Well, DeHaan exposed what is often called immortal time bias, or basically the miscategorization of the vaccination window.
Okay, walk me through that.
So in many of these massive institutional studies, if a person received an injection, they were not categorized as vaccinated until 14 days after the shot.
Right, because the logic was that it takes 2 weeks for the immune system to build a response.
Exactly. That sounds reasonable on the surface.
It does.
Until you look at the risk profile. If the intervention itself carries a risk of a severe adverse event, say a cardiovascular issue, that event is most likely to happen in the days immediately following the injection.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. Because of the 14-day rule, if a patient suffered a fatal reaction on day 5, their death was statistically recorded in the unvaccinated column.
Wait, seriously?
It's serious.
So you are taking the exact deaths potentially caused by the intervention and mathematically using them to inflate the danger of being unvaccinated.
Yes, it's a catastrophic methodological flaw.
That's insane.
And DeHaan mathematically proved that this categorization error rendered the study's conclusions completely baseless. He showed the math.
And the astonishing part of the documentary is the institutional reaction to this proof.
Yeah, this part is wild.
The institutions actually admitted it.
They did.
They looked at DeHaan's math and conceded that their methodology was flawed. But then they went to the national newspapers and explicitly stated, quote, "The conclusion remains the same."
Our data is wrong. Our methods are biased, but our conclusion is correct.
Right.
It is the complete antithesis of the scientific method. True science demands that your conclusion is a captive of your data.
Right. If the data is invalidated, the conclusion must be thrown out.
You think so?
What they're describing is an institution starting with a politically necessary conclusion, that the interventions are perfect, and trying to brute force the data to support it.
And when the data collapses, they just declare the conclusion is still true by fiat?
It's confirmation bias on a systemic scale.
Right. So as a listener, if you are following the documentary's logic up to this point, you hit a massive roadblock.
Yeah, you do.
Because if the national statistics are shifted to hide anomalies,
What?
if the clinical diagnoses are warped by financial incentives,
Yeah.
and if the regulatory studies are methodologically bankrupt, where do you go to find the truth?
If you can't trust the spreadsheets, you have to bypass the abstraction of statistics entirely.
You have to look at the physical evidence.
You have to look inside the bodies.
Which brings us to the pathologists.
The film introduces Frank van de Rooij, a well-known Dutch pathologist.
Right. And he immediately points out a massive cultural and systemic blind spot.
Which is,
Autopsies are incredibly rare in the Netherlands.
really, the film states that less than 1% of deaths result in an autopsy. Less than 1%.
It's a tiny fraction.
That means 99% of the time, doctors are essentially making an educated guess based on external symptoms and medical history.
We are not actually looking under the hood to verify the exact physiological mechanism of death.
But Van de Rooij is looking under the hood.
He is, and when he performs autopsies, particularly on cases of unexpected or sudden death, he's using specialized tissue analysis.
Like immunohistochemistry staining, to look for specific biomarkers.
Exactly. It's like a dye that highlights specific proteins. And he claims to be finding something highly alarming.
Artificial synthetic material.
Yes. Specifically, synthetic spike proteins deeply lodged in the organ tissues.
Okay, let's walk through the initial logic of the documentary here, because it seems to provide the smoking gun the filmmaker was searching for.
Right. The logic is, if a pathologist finds a synthetic, man-made spike protein in your heart or lung tissue, and we know that protein does not occur in nature,
It must have come from the only artificial intervention introduced to the entire global population over the last few years.
it's a very clean, direct line of causality. It perfectly supports the hypothesis that the 23,000 excess deaths are linked to the rollout.
Right. But this is where the source material introduces a massive, narrative-shattering complication.
Oh man, the twist.
Yeah, they bring in another scientist, microbiologist Roger Lowen.
Roger Lowen is a fascinating, highly controversial figure.
He was a prominent microbiologist at the Erasmus Medical Center, right, a major Dutch hospital.
He was, but he was allegedly fired very early in the pandemic because he started openly questioning the official narratives.
Specifically regarding the cycle thresholds and accuracy of PCR testing methods.
Right. He was ostracized by the institutional establishment for not towing the line, but he set up his own independent laboratory.
And as a rigorous scientist, he knew he couldn't just look at recent autopsies. He needed a control group.
He needed to look at tissue from before the interventions even existed.
So he managed to acquire and test lung tissue from patients who died in Wuhan, China.
In December 2019.
This is so crucial. December 2019 is months before any vaccines were developed, let alone distributed.
And when Lowen tested those 2019 pre-vaccine lungs, what did he find?
He found the exact same artificial synthetic spike protein material.
This is the moment the entire axis of the documentary shifts.
We really need to pause and unpack the massive implications of this because it is dizzying.
It really is.
According to Lowen in the interview, finding this synthetic, non-natural material in victims from 2019 proves with absolute 100% certainty that the virus itself was not a natural occurrence.
Right. It proves it was bioengineered, a lab creation, a lab leak.
It completely incinerates the theory that this virus evolved naturally in a wet market.
Completely. But if we connect this revelation back to Frank de Rooij's core premise, the 900 excess deaths a week, it complicates the investigation exponentially.
It tangles the entire web of causality.
Yes. Because originally, the filmmaker's equation was simple. Synthetic spike protein in the tissue equals vaccine damage.
Right. But if the virus itself is also synthetic,
Yeah.
if the virus is a bioengineered lab creation designed to deliver synthetic spike proteins, then how on earth does a pathologist differentiate the damage?
They theoretically can't.
Wow.
If Van de Rooij finds a synthetic spike protein in a deceased patient today, he can no longer definitively point to the syringe.
Because that protein could be from the intervention, or it could be lingering damage from a previous infection with the engineered virus itself.
Exactly. Both vectors introduce a non-natural, potentially highly toxic substance into the human body.
It's terrifying. You have a synthetic pathogen circulating in the global population's bodies. whether introduced by a medical intervention or a cough, and it's causing systemic damage.
And the authorities across the board are allegedly looking the other way.
If this is all true, why the absolute silence?
Because the political and geopolitical stakes are basically apocalyptic.
Yeah.
If Western governments acknowledge the massive scale of the physiological harm, they don't just have to admit a catastrophic failure of their pharmaceutical regulatory agencies.
Which is bad enough.
Right. They also have to admit that global biosecurity completely failed.
They have to admit that a highly dangerous engineered pathogen escaped a lab, and that international health organizations lied about it for years to protect scientific funding and geopolitical relationships. It's a massive house of cards.
It is.
If you pull the card labeled vaccine injury, you inevitably bring down the card labeled lab leak, and vice versa.
Exposing one exposes the massive systemic lies of the other.
Which brings us to the final sobering segment of the documentary.
Right.
With claims, this explosive synthetic lab viruses, 75,000 pages approved in a weekend without review, manipulated safety databases, and 900 unexplained deaths every single week. Why isn't this film front-page news?
Why isn't every major network clamoring to broadcast this investigation?
The filmmaker ran into a total wall of silence.
Yeah. According to the interview, Frank de Rooij cannot get his film distributed through any mainstream or reputable channels.
The public broadcasters in the Netherlands programs like Zembla and Nieuwsuur, which are historically famous for their hard-hitting investigative journalism, they've completely rejected it.
Even the independent circuits refused it.
Right. The interview mentions Movies That Matter,
Which is a prominent film festival specifically dedicated to exposing human rights abuses and institutional corruption.
and they flatly refuse to screen it.
This raises an important question regarding the role of media.
Yeah.
Because the historical contrast here is what really stands out. The interview brings up the swine flu epidemic from over a decade ago.
Yeah.
Back then, when there were faint rumblings about rushed vaccine contracts and potential neurological side effects like narcolepsy, the public broadcasters were ruthless.
They functioned exactly as the Fourth Estate should.
They made primetime documentaries, they ambushed health ministers in the streets, they forced the government to answer incredibly tough questions on the record.
They acted as the watchdogs of democracy.
But now, faced with an anomaly of 23,000 extra deaths a year and massive allegations of data fraud, that same media apparatus is entirely silent.
The watchdog hasn't just stopped barking. It appears to have been sedated.
But the interview reveals something even more tragic than institutional or media silence.
It brings the story down to a deeply personal, human level.
Because it's not just the governments and the journalists who don't want to engage with this material.
It's the public. It's our own families.
The filmmaker shows a very raw anecdote.
Yeah, he says his own mother and his girlfriend are completely exhausted by his obsession with this investigation.
They tell him things like, "Are you still talking about COVID? Just stop. Go do something fun."
We do something fun.
He's staring at a spreadsheet of tens of thousands of unexplained deaths, and his loved ones are asking him to change the subject.
It is a staggering disconnect. But, from a psychological standpoint, it's entirely understandable.
Because we have all lived through a protracted global trauma.
Years of lockdowns, pervasive fear of severe illness, economic ruin, the fracturing of social relationships.
After a trauma of that magnitude, there is a deep, primal desire in the collective consciousness to simply move on.
People want the X-ray to be clean.
Yes. What this documentary is asking people to do is to open the book back up and examine the darkest chapters.
It's suggesting that the people who promise to protect us, the doctors, the regulatory agencies, the politicians, might have fundamentally failed us.
Or worse, actively deceived us to protect themselves from liability.
Investigating that trauma, actually looking at the possibility that our trusted institutions are compromised by billion-dollar contracts and data manipulation, it requires an immense amount of cognitive energy and emotional courage.
And for the vast majority of people, the cognitive dissonance is simply too painful to bear.
They prefer the silence.
Because acknowledging the truth would demand action, and society is simply too exhausted to act.
Which brings us to the end of an incredibly dense, heavy journey.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
We've gone from a shifting baseline, hiding 23,000 yearly deaths, to allegations of real-time data scraping, catching safety monitors, deleting severe adverse events.
Through the massive structural trap of government indemnification contracts.
Past the flawed methodologies of immortal time bias in observational studies.
All the way to a shocking twist involving pathologists finding synthetic lab virus proteins in 2019.
And it all ends at a seemingly impenetrable wall of institutional and public apathy.
It really is a portrait of a society actively choosing to look the other way.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Okay.
We rely on the machinery of our institutions, our scientific bodies, our media, our statistics bureaus, to tell us when something is broken.
Right.
But what happens when the very machine we use to take the X-ray is quietly recalibrated by the people operating it, specifically to hide the fractures?
If a society fundamentally loses the willingness to investigate its own glaring anomalies because the potential answers are too uncomfortable, too financially ruinous, or politically devastating.
What happens to the next generation's trust when the next inevitable crisis hits?
It is a terrifying question. When the watchdogs stop barking, does the silence eventually become more dangerous than the truth itself?
Something we all need to carefully consider as we navigate the years ahead. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly complex deep dive. We'll be back next time to unpack another stack of sources. Until then, keep asking questions.